All right, let's get started. So, the problem we had in September 2008 was we really did not have any legal tools, or policy tools that allowed us to let Bear Stearns and AIG and the other firms go bankrupt in a way that would not cause incredible damage to the rest of the system. And therefore, we chose the lesser of two evils and prevented AIG from failing. That being said, we want to be sure that this never happens again. We want to be sure that the system is changed so that if a large systematically critical firm like AIG comes under this kind of pressure in the future, there will be a safe way to let it fail so that it can fail and the consequences of its mistakes can be borne by its management and shareholders and creditors without bringing down the whole financial system. Finally, let me say a few words about the consequences of the crisis. We did stop the meltdown. We avoided that would have we avoided what would have been, I think, a collapse of the global financial system. That was obviously a good thing, but one thing that I was always sure of, and the Federal Reserve was always sure of, was that a collapse of some of these big financial firms was going to have very serious collateral consequences. There were people arguing even as late as September 2008, well, why don't you just let the firms collapse? There is a system that can take care of it, bankruptcy. Why don't you let them fail? We never thought that was a good option, particularly if the whole system had collapsed. We would have had extraordinarily serious consequences. As it was, even though we prevented a total meltdown, there were still very serious collateral impacts, not just on the US economy, but on the global economy as well. So, failing the crisis, even though the crisis was brought under control, the US economy and much of the global economy went into a sharp recession. US GDP fell by more than 5%, which is a quite which is quite a deep recession. 8.5 million people lost their jobs and unemployment rose to 10%. And as I said, this was not just a US situation. The US recession was, in fact, a rather average recession. Many countries around the world had worse declines, particularly those dependent on international trade. So it was a global slowdown. And as all this was happening, fears of another Great Depression were very real. Nevertheless, the Great Depression was much worse than the recent recession, and I think the view is increasingly gaining acceptance that without the forceful policy response that stabilized the financial system in 2008 and early 2009, we could have had a much worse outcome in the economy. I will close with a couple of indicators to compare the recent recession with the Great Depression. First, the figure 28 shows the stock market. The darker line starts in August 1929, which was the peak of the stock market before the Great Depression. The lighter line shows the more recent stock prices starting in October 2007, and then each of the graphs shows you the evolution of stock prices in the depression period and in the more recent period. What is striking is that for the first 15 or 16 months, stock prices in the United States behaved in this crisis very much as they did in 1929 and 1930. but about 15 or 16 months into the recent recession in early 2009, about the time that the financial crisis was stabilizing, look what happened. In the Depression era, stock prices kept falling, and as I mentioned, in the end, stock prices lost 85% of their value. In the recent crisis, by contrast, US stock prices recovered and began a long recovery, and they now are more than double where they were 3 years ago. 85%. Lost 85% of its value. Is it? Yeah. No, it's not. Lost 15% of its value, and it in 5 years it recovered 85% of the value. So think about the retirees between these 5 years. They must have been devastated during that time. That's the problem. That's always the